Greetings, Ted Auto here. How do you double the price of a Soviet car? You just fill the tank. These cars are so awful that you cannot take them without a dash of humor. In the Soviet Union, people had to save over 11,000 rubles, which would be about 106,000 pounds at this point. Go to a car dealership, pay upfront, and then find out that you could only get the car in 10 years. When people did get their order, they found themselves alone with an extremely bad car, poor design, unreliable construction, and most of these cars were also quite strange. So why did people in the Soviet Union build such a bad cars? This is a new video, where we will tell you about the cars of such a bad quality that they should have been sent straight out of the factory for scrap. Before we get to our top 5, let's break down how things get to the point where cars cost like a kidney and wait in line for them measuring in 10 years. Well, the country we now call Russia was a pretty strange place in the 60s and 70s. The Soviet Union has been subjected to a communist regime. The state was throwing most of its strength into increasing its military might. This meant that all engineers, scientists, designers, and technology and materials were used primarily for military purposes, and only then to improve the quality of the cars. In addition, all automobile production was under complete control of the government. They decided which cars would be produced, which improved, which imported, who would buy them, and how many would be put on the sale. As we shall see in the video, the machines were designed to be absolutely primitive. They could not look even the slightest bit elite and had to live and function forever. Let's imagine for a second that you are a hard-working citizen of the Soviet Union and you saved up for years to buy a car. But even just getting the right to buy one of those awful cars was not easy. The state strictly regulated the distribution of the cars. There was a strictly defined number of cars given to each individual company, whose heads would later decide who would be given the right to buy. However, even if you were employee of the month, that might not be enough for such a privilege. The companies interviewed all of the employees, figuring out which ones were the hardest working and most valuable employees. And of course, supporting the Communist Party only increased your chances. After all that, you could place an order for an extremely overrated semblance of a car and wait 4 to 10 years for the vehicle. Such timelines meant that demand was so huge that Soviet manufacturers saw no need to buy something new. So they continued to build disastrously outdated cars for 10 years. And even if they were going to improve a model or add something, they had to make all production changes through government agencies, and as you might imagine, this process was not quick. And now we're getting close to our number 5 spot of the top, the Volga 24. It is not the worst model among other members. Compared to other Soviet cars, it perfectly captures the key points of the Soviet car industry. Take a look at this, the 1975 Volga 24. Now, look at these European cars of the same year of production. The Volga was stuck in the 60s and showed no sign of changing. It had a very long wheelbase and a flimsy suspension, especially for Russian roads. And of course, no power steering. Driving such a car was like a training in the gym. It was even nicknamed the Bug. This model was released in 1970, and since then it has not changed until 1997, when Volga released an updated version, 2410. It would seem that along with this should have been updated design. For example, maybe they would have added power steerings, central locks, or even fuel injection systems, all the things that were considered pretty commonplace all around the world. But no, the government had no desire to improve the quality of the cars. They were chasing quantity, so they began to degrade quality, thereby simplifying production. They were replacing engines with cheaper, lower-powered ones and replacing the chrome trim with the plastic trim. All this just to optimize the production. The only good thing about this car was that it could be equipped with a 5.5-liter V8 engine. But these models were designed mainly for Soviet officials and not for common people, and they only had 2.5 liters. This was actually a plus because even if you could afford a car, more often that not buying a fuel would be a problem. There were only a few gas stations where you could fill up the gasoline at some super high prices. But technically, there was also a black market. You just had to know the right people and not get caught by the authorities. And such situations explain the existence of the following cars created with clearly defined characteristics, low price and pleasant fuel consumption. The Hugo 45 was a front-wheel drive 3-door car built in Yugoslavia. Like most Soviet cars, it was based on European models which were simply adapted to the local market. Such a car no longer had a better suspension as well as many replaceable parts for cheaper models. The Hugo was based on Fiat 127, a car that was generally not bad, yet the Russian manufacturers honestly mutilated it. These cars were created as a very cheap, only 8,000 modern dollars for a new car. That is, a lot of things were simply cut in the manufacturing process. They were very unreliable. The interior was made of cheap plastic that was forever cracking, and the steering wheel was so out of control that people said the car drove itself. The car had a 1.1-liter 4-cylinder engine that produced 55 horsepower, which was actually quite enough for such a passenger car model. And the manufacturers had so little rust tripping on the cars that it got even lighter after a couple of years. The interesting fact is that for some people unknown reasons, the states imported them as low-priced cars that sold fine, but were still lauded worldwide as one of the worst cars. They were disastrously unreliable, not surprising given that the people who worked on these plants were mostly military men who smoked and drank brandy all the time on the job, materials purchased solely for cost reasons, and the factories themselves were vile. No wonder that the list of side effects is so long. Moving to the number 3, this thing is more of a blob of tension than a machine. It's called Velorex, Velox or Velorex. Don't know how to pronounce it right, but it looks pretty cool. A clever and unorthodox way of a situation involving fuel shortages and rising street prices in Soviet Czechoslovakia at that time. The car was made from a cloud of parts from motorcycles, including the engine that made 8 horsepower at best. 8 horsepower. The whole machine barely weighed about 290 pounds. Thanks to the lightweight space frame and the body made of vinyl stretched over the frame, such cars were surprisingly popular special cars for the disabled and were often given away at ridiculously low prices or for nothing at all. The Russians created a counterpart which of course was much worse. This counterpart is called SMZ and is technically a microcar, which again was only popular because it was given out by the government literally for free to those deemed to be in need. And that explains why no effort was made to improve the design or construction. Many people said that it was just an enlarged version of a toy car. They weighed about 500 pounds, not really that little for a car of that size, and had a small 356 SS engine. They were hopelessly slow, reaching a maximum of 34 miles per hour, unless of course the Russian roads allowed that speed of the engine overhead. They've continued in production from 1974 until 1997, when they had the Mini. The difference in model quality and space is evident, but the most incredible thing is the design. It is so awful that in some ways it's even funny. And now we come to number 1. What could be the worst that a car collection already presented? Well, the Trabant. These cars were built mainly in Soviet East Germany and were a response to the West German Volkswagen Beetle cars in the front of a kind of communist redesign. They went on sale in 1957. They were 4-seat cars made from a strange material called Duraplast, which was created from recycled cotton waste. It was similar to fiberglass, relatively lightweight and durable. It was used because it wasn't in a short supply like steel and it was adequately priced and didn't rust. Except that although the shell didn't rust, everything underneath is corroded. But that's not important. For a long time, these cars were among the most affordable in East Germany, being the best of the worst. However, this also meant that the average waiting time to get this order was about 15 years. To be clearer, imagine that you ordered yourself a 3rd series BMW 15 years ago. This would mean that there would now be an E90 just out of the factory, but already obsolete. Such a car had 600 SS 2-stroke engine, which was quite reliable, but infamous for the exhaust that came from the fact that the fuel would stratify after long periods of parking, and the car burned just oil for the first few minutes after starting up. The car was springy for rough roads so much so that if you had passengers on the back seat, the front of the car would scoot so high that you had to lower the headlights to see anything. These cars were produced from 1957 to 1991 and were widely known for their simplicity. They were incredibly loud, not to mention how unreliable they were. It was not even that Trabant was bad in 1957, but that it wasn't changed in any way until 1991, when it got even worse. And that's all for now. This story was brought to you by TED Auto. Like this video, subscribe to the channel and remember, car is more than just a transport.